Okay, my name's John Davis. I am currently, since July, Professor of Education in the School of Education at Strathclyde University. I was previously Professor of Childhood Inclusion at Edinburgh University. I'm going to be talking to you today about my views on resilience. I'm going to be drawing from a range of sources to do that. And I've provided a PowerPoint, and there's links and references at the end of the PowerPoint. And basically, what I'm going to start by doing is kind of raising some questions about concepts of resilience. In particular, in Scotland, there's been a movie recently called Resilience, which has sought to encourage professionals to engage with adverse childhood experiences, or as it's become known, ACEs, and it's raised some concerns from a number of quarters around the potential for this approach to label children. So I'm going to be talking about the different critiques of ACE discourses and resilience discourses. I'm also going to question, some people say, okay, we're not really into resilience, but we're really interested in working around issues of trauma. And I think trauma is of course, is something that we want to support children with, and we want to enable children to overcome experiences of trauma. But there is also problems with the issue of trauma, and I will in particular be using Sean Ginwright's critique of trauma and his promotion of a healing-centred approach to move the debate on. Key questions that I'll be raising will be about issues of power. Who does the ACE discourse benefit? And I'll be putting forward alternatives. I'll be discussing some critiques from within. For example, Jane Evans, who works around resilience, has some ethical issues about the ACE discourse. I will be discussing critiques from academics. For example, Edwards et al. Gave evidence to a committee at Westminster. Davidson and Carlin in Edinburgh University have critiqued the individualistic psychoanalytical approach of resilience, and Blaisdell has critiqued the fact that resilience often ignores the politics and structures around children. And I'll also be discussing some writing by Gary Walsh, who has critiqued ACEs from a children's rights perspective. Once I've set up that critique, I'll then be moving on to discuss what the alternatives are. So I'll be drawing from some writing I've done with Christina Malherbe-Quarrel, looking at empathy, social justice and rights, and I'll also be drawing, as always, from the work of Pat Dolan and colleagues in Galway around a strength-based and empathetic approach. In particular, I'll be talking about Pat's view that empathy can be learned. And finally, I'll connect that to approaches that have been working on for over 10 years in Scotland as part of the Getting It Right for Every Child approach, which was a policy that started in 2005. And I'll be arguing that if we get it right for every child and adult in Scotland using a holistic assessment that considers issues of discrimination, social justice, inclusion, and strength-based working, then actually will shift the power relationships in this debate. So turning to the resilience film concerning adverse childhood experiences. The film's been shown around Scotland, and it has come from America. It lists a series of adult childhood experiences that we have to be concerned about. And these include a parent or adult swearing at you, insulting you, putting you down, humiliating you, pushing, grabbing, slapping, or throwing something at you. It also includes seeing your mother pushed, grabbed, slapped, kicked, bitten, hit with something hard, or having something thrown at her, and being repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes, or threatened with a gun or a knife. Another ACE is having a person 5 years older than you touch your body in a sexual way. Another one is feeling that no one in your family loved you, thought you important or special, looked out for you, felt close to you or supported you. And another one is feeling you didn't have enough to eat, have enough to wear, had dirty clothes or no one to protect you. Another one is experiencing drug or alcohol abuse in the family, or experiencing the loss of a biological parent through divorce, abandonment, or another reason, e.g. imprisonment, and experiencing a household member depressed, mentally ill, or attempting suicide. Now, all of these issues are serious issues that we want to support children to get through. We want to, in some cases, utilise the law if a child has been abused, or if behaviours are involve domestic violence, and we want to we do not want to defend behaviours that are abuse. So when I'm approaching my critique, I'm coming from the perspective that people do things that we don't agree with, but we have to understand those things, and we have to understand what the solutions are to those things. The ACE discourse raises a number of key questions for me. Why are we using the term ACE instead of abuse? Why are we asking folk to self-label as having ACEs? Why does such a way of speaking make certain people more powerful and powerless? What are the problems with checklists, and what does a considered multidisciplinary and well-researched approach to childhood say is the alternative to an ACE discourse? Okay, so turning to the critique from within, Jane Evans, who's a counsellor, has written on her blog, "Let's not sprinkle ACEs everywhere." She says that working with traumatised people over 2 decades has taught me that asking about their trauma has to be done in the context of what this might do to them in the moments they are discussing it, and very importantly, when the session or conversation is over, we need to consider the consequences of the discussion. She says that the idea we should ask about and identify every child's adverse experiences is problematic. We should never assume people view their childhood as having been adverse or traumatic. Just asking the questions and relating them to a list of health problems, social needs and behaviours is not enough. We have to actually have a plan for after we identify adverse childhood experiences. Indeed, Evans says when she heard about the ACE checklist, it caused several chills to run down my spine. The idea we should ask about and identify every childhood experience is problematic because we don't know what's going to happen after that moment. Similarly, Edwards et al. Have given evidence to Westminster Committee, and they considered the research base for ACEs. And they thought that the ACE discourse was skewed in 3 main ways. The way that it asserts biological risk, the way it uses retrospective reporting of abuse, and self-evaluation in terms of ACE interventions not being independently evaluated. Okay. They suggest that self-recollection is a notoriously inaccurate way to establish causations, not least because such recollections are subjective and unverifiable. So their argument is that we would have to find a set of indicators to show that there is a relationship between adverse childhood experiences and subsequent health illnesses. We'd have to find a set of indicators that were more independent than personal reporting. Most of the evaluations, and they also argue that most of the evaluations of ACE studies are conducted by researchers with a vested interest and are not replicable nor independent. And we know from previous studies, in 2005 the Scottish Government commissioned the Hallam report, which looked at interventions in health in early years, and many of those interventions were seen as problematic. For example, triple P parenting, PAC approach, where parents are encouraged to learn about different types of parenting, was found to only have an effect on parents who were already good parents and didn't work with feisty working class women. So the Hallam report suggested that such interventions were very rarely evaluated by independent people. In terms of the American movie, we see a group of health professionals who, I would argue, are working from a perspective of trying to solve situations and trying to support change, but in some ways they have not clarified their concepts, and they are only working in quite a limited way. And some of the language they use is problematic. And Edwards argues words like dosed response and toxic stress are oversimplistic metaphors that kind of ratchet up the tension around these topics. We have to do something now. And we saw that actually a few years ago at the Galway conference, where there was a spokesperson from Triple P, and he showed, I don't know if people were at that conference, but if you remember, they showed various videos of the violent society we now live in, clips from newsreels showing youth being dangerous, and then said you need this parenting pack because it will solve this problem. So we have to be very careful when we listen to people who are using exaggerated metaphors, simplistic metaphors, and exaggerating the tension in our society in order to promote a single silver bullet for the problems that children and families encounter. The Edwards study also argue that not all adverse experiences have long-term effects. In fact, they argue that large cohorts of people have survived horrific things such as concentration camps and live fulfilled lives. So there's a danger that we only label people by their adverse experience and don't see their abilities to overcome. They also suggest that the ACE discourses turn an individual into an object who is subject to experiences, not a human being who interprets them. And I think what is quite interesting about the way we use science is often we can get a picture of something, or we get a snapshot using statistics or using surveys. But to understand the process, you need a much more qualitative and in-depth approach. And I would argue that we've been doing that qualitative approach in Scotland for a number of years, and I'll come to that later when we talk about the getting it right for every child approach. Edwards also argues that the ACEs approach denies childhood agency. It tends to stigmatise children rather than see their ability to solve their own life problems. And they do not extend, the ACE discourses do not extend beyond the family as a source of life issues. So they miss out things like the important poverty, homelessness and hunger caused by politicians. They tend to see hunger as something happening in the family, or having dirty clothes as something happening in the family and not related to the fact, for example, in the UK, the benefit system have been hugely changed and are now punishing bigger families, and that this is a political decision. In this sense, Edwards et al. Argue that the ACEs discourse is very dangerous because it only limits us to looking and blaming individuals and families if used inappropriately. I should add that many people are using the ACE discourses because they're trying to help. So they may or may not be aware of the dangers in the process that they're adopting. Now, Davidson and Carlin pick up on this kind of individualization of trauma and of adverse childhood experiences, and they suggest that it comes from a psychoanalytical tradition of resilience, writing on resilience, that is focused on curing psychological dispositions in the individual and trying to change personality traits in individuals within families rather than taking a holistic approach. They argue politically this enables the state to avoid changes that reduce entrenched long-term and complex inequalities across populations. So similar to Edwards, they see that they see a need to balance the individual with structural issues in the individual's life. They also say that the ACE discourses focus, or resilience discourses focus on steeling young people to bounce back from adversity. So they put the pressure on the young person to show resilience, and in a way that suggests that childhood adversities are unavoidable. And I would argue that adversity is unavoidable. Things happen in our lives. We can't know when we're going to lose a loved one or a family member to illness. But at the same time, some adversities are avoidable. And we know for sure that when you increase the amount of children in poverty because of your political decisions, that was avoidable. And I think this is where Davison and Carlin, and also later on I'll explain my writing with Christina Merlev-Quoro. This is where a wider societal approach to childhood is required. The other thing I would say is that using the stealing young people thing, I also think that we can think of stealing another way. So there are a number of people who want to promote their products as a solution, as a magic bullet solution, and I think that we have to be very careful that people don't steal young people's lives for their financial gain, because they have a product to sell. Because, for example, in Scotland, the Scottish Government is trying to close the gap in attainment between working class and better off children. They have a need for solutions. So you can see where consultants come along and they tap into that need. So I think we could use the idea of stealing in different ways. And finally, the Davison and Carlin resilience critique argues that if we support self-esteem, confidence and mental well-being, we can't do this through a single approach. It's a complex process, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on. Cara Blaisdell's writing suggests that realising that children's behaviour may relate to life stresses is important, but the ACE film does not question how inequalities come about on a structural level or through institutional practices. So she draws from a number of writers, Kustacher 2017, Constantoni 2013, Tillett and Wong 2017, to argue that institutional practices, for example, when professionals gloss over racism rather than challenge racism in a schooling situation, are things that create adverse childhood experiences. Those are things that we can address, but we need to examine how cultural, political, and legal contexts shape the choices and senses of belonging to country and community that is available to children and families. And we see that in the current Brexit debate and also in America. That's where I think the ACE film really let itself down. It didn't really go beyond the boundaries of the family and the medical professional to question why there's gun violence in America, or question why there's racism in America. And I think it's important that we start to do this. And I've had people, when I've presented at ACE meetings, say to me, "Oh, but you're saying that working class children." You're giving working class children an excuse not to succeed academically. That is not what I'm doing at all. Anybody who follows my work will understand this. I take a holistic approach that is complex. So what I'm saying is that there are a complex number of reasons that working class children don't experience fair educational outcomes. And those include resources around families that governments make decisions about, as well as the practices within institutions. And this is where Kustacher and Constantoni's work is really helpful. Practices within institutions. So you can have a teacher who is prejudiced about a child just because of the postcode area they come from, or the community they come from, or because of history about a family name in an area. Those things are as important to challenge as the wider structural issues. So prejudice about attainment and ability and capability is something I've always challenged because I experienced it myself growing up. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail when I define social justice and I draw from Pat Dolan's work on Honneth later on. Gary Walsh, in a test article which he's given me early sight of, which is about to come out, has said we should aim to support families and prevent abuse and build hopeful, loving relationships. And so again, he's not saying that the issues within the ACE film are unimportant, or the issues within resilience discourses are unimportant, but he says that we need to prevent abuse and at the same time as recognising that some childhood adversity may actually build resilience, support relationships, and develop a sense of shared identity. So if you go through a difficult time and people pull together, then actually, as the Edwards article was answering, these things may not define your identity. The adverse childhood experience doesn't define your identity. The sense of shared relationships, support, community, a place in your community, a shared identity is what emerges for the young person. And he says it's really risky when we ask young people to define themselves through an ACE checklist, or as is seen in the movie, where whole rooms of adults are asked to do it. He says it's unethical in relation to children. He says it violates children's rights to privacy, consent, and participation. Participation in the sense that the children has the right to voice and to define their own identity. And he says that it risks perpetuating hierarchical adult-child relationships where the adult feels the need to intervene rather than support the child to get to the places that they want to get to. And we'll look later on at how the Gerfeck approach tries to support the child to define the things in their lives in a much wider way. Gary also argues that empathy, love, and compassion are the solutions. And I think it's really interesting when we use those words rather than professional intervention. So empathy, love, and compassion come from different sources, and it doesn't need the professional to be a stormtrooper for the state. The professional can actually sit back a bit and support the pathways to community and informal support. And this relates to Pat Dolan's writing with colleagues in Galway around the need to start our approaches to children's services from a perspective of minimum intervention. Or in the books I've written with Mary Smith, where we've discussed how a family support service, when at the point of engagement with families, already is planning for the moment where they're not supporting and looking for the community-based networks to enable support long after the professionals have gone away. And I think often in the past, when I was working with disabled parents and children, we found social workers kind of stocking up cases and not coming to resolution, not taking forward plans, not evaluating assessments and service delivery plans. So this is why myself and Mary wrote about the need to have a plan of minimum intervention and a plan of planning to the point where the family is supported in their community but not necessarily by professionals. Of course, some disabled families and some people with medical issues will constantly be in contact with professionals throughout their lifetimes. But the question is, during those processes, who is making the decision on what the best course forward is? And an idea of informed consent is very strong in our way of thinking about children's services. Now, Sean Gainwright in America has picked up on the idea that resilience is a thing that often masks the politics of American society. And he has not only critiqued the idea of resilience, but he's moved on to critique the idea of trauma. And some people have said, well, they're interested in the ACE thing, but they're interested from a trauma perspective. Of course, we want to solve trauma, but Sean argues there's even limitations to the term trauma-informed care. And he does it in a very similar way to the other writers. He gives a story of during a healing circle he was leading with a group of African-American young men. All of them had experienced some form of trauma, ranging from sexual abuse, violence, homelessness, abandonment, or all of those things. And Sean said during one of the sessions he explained the impact of stress and trauma on brain development and how trauma can influence emotional health. So he explained to the young people the ACE discourse. And he says, as he was explaining, one of the young men in the group abruptly stopped him and said, "I'm more than what happened to me. I'm not just my trauma." Sean says he was puzzled at first, but it didn't take him long to really contemplate what the young man was saying. So if we think of that again, I am more than what happened to me. I am not just my trauma. So that takes us back to the Edwards point earlier, that people have gone through horrendous experiences, but they've actually gone on to live fulfilling lives. So this young man, in his own words, is saying what Edwards has argued using references in academic articles. So Ginwright wants us to shift to an asset, strengths and capabilities approach. As I've said, we've been using that kind of model for quite a while now in Scotland and in Ireland. He argues that trauma-informed care is like saying you're the worst thing that happened to you. It ignores the assets, strengths and capabilities of children and young people. It provides very little insight on how we might address the root causes of trauma in neighbourhoods, families and schools. And by only treating the individual, we only address half the equation, leaving the toxic systems, policies and practice neatly intact. You see that shift from toxic childhood to toxic systems, policies and practices. But like what I was saying earlier, it's the way that the teacher approaches a child in the school or the poverty that the government creates. He's shifted that discourse over and is pointing it in the other direction now. Ginwright argues that some counselling techniques that we know work with trauma don't have a longer-term impact. So he's saying they're designed to simply reduce negative emotions and behaviours, to treat trauma as a pathology, not enable well-being. So there's a difference between treatment and a process. Yeah. And he argues that the absence of a disease does not constitute health. So you can treat a disease or you can mask some symptoms, but it doesn't mean that you're living a fulfilled, healthy life. Nor does the absence of violence constitute peace. So you can have a ceasefire, but nobody's sorted out the conflict. And he argues that the reduction of pathology, that's anxiety, anger, fear, sadness, distrust, doesn't constitute well-being. Well-being is more hope, happiness, imagination, aspiration, trust. You see those words again? We were talking about words earlier. So hope, happiness, imagination, aspirations, and trust. They're all words that bring you a connection or build a relationship or take you in a process that you aren't on your own. And he argues we should replace rigid medical model treatment with a healing-centered approach. And he has 4 key parts, and he says that the healing-centered approach moves the question from what happened to you to what's right for you. And I think that's really important when I discussed in a minute the Gerfecht approach, getting it right for every child approach in Scotland. His 4 key parts to this shift are political, so do young people have power in their schools and communities? Cultural, do we support their identities through music, creativity, expression, dreams and imagination? Do we see view children and young people? The third one is, do we view children and young people as having assets and as agents in the creation of their own well-being, rather than victims of traumatic effects? So we shift them to beings who can change their lives, from victims who are stuck and limited in that deficit kind of snapshot model. And he argues that in making that shift to see them as active beings, we can actually value their critical reflection and their ability to develop their own loving actions. And finally, he says, do we take an approach, a healing-centered approach takes a holistic approach to the restoration of well-being, including adult community members, and using empathy to connect with the perspectives of other people in your communities. Now, I also talk about that in my book in 2011 in chapter 8 on integrated children's services, and I also talk about it with Mary Smith, and I'll discuss that in a minute, in a book called Working in Multi-Professional Services. And Sean's blog also connected with writing that I've been doing online on the People's Republic of Scotia blog with Christina Malherbe-Quarrel around empathy, social justice and rights. So on that writing, we argue that the ACE film mainly perpetuates the deficit idea that people who live in poverty have to be taught how to control themselves. So there's actually a moment in the film, where a medical professional tells a young boy what his identity is and why he's misbehaving, instead of asking. And we find that really problematic. We argue that there's an industry of middle-class consultants using such films to exploit children for financial gain, to blame families and hoodwink public servants. And these consultants ignore the historical context of adversity. And we talk about the Glasgow Effect report also on our People's Republic of Scotia blog. And when you look at why people in Glasgow have worse health outcomes than people in Liverpool and Manchester with similar economic backgrounds, you find that 60 years of migration and poor housing policy in Glasgow, and the disempowerment of new migrants and subsequent populations is one of the key aspects of why there's ill health. So the Glasgow Effect report is an incredible amount of health scientists were involved in the writing of this report. It's incredibly rigorous research, has come to that conclusion. And in our article, we talk about the alternatives to that, which is projects like Galway, where they use music, creativity to work with men on mental health issues. They have people at the Clyde working in groups to build boats out of wood and sail the boats on the Clyde. So you see the connection with Sean's blog post, where he's saying that the four key parts to a healing-centered approach include music and creativity. And we are very strongly of that opinion too, because when you're developing your music, when you're connecting with other people using instruments or song or voice, or poetry if you're creating your own poems, or when you're working with your hands with other people to achieve a common goal, that is you taking power of those moments. So it enables you to develop your sense of self and your sense of achievement, to look at your own capabilities, to achieve things that you maybe never even thought you would be able to do. That contrasts with the Glasgow Effect report, where the Glasgow Effect report argues that for 5,000 more people a year die in Scotland than would be the case if we had actually designed our public services from a process of empowering local citizens. And the report has a very telling sentence. It says, although usually expressed in statistical terms such as standardized rates or ratios or expected years of life, behind each summary of epidemiological expression lies a genuine human tragedy. Individual stories of shortened, wasted lives, pain, sickness, early death and grief, affecting individual men, women and children, their families, friends and communities. So this is where a very powerful report asking us to think about the context of the way that we do public health, the way that we do public services in Scotland. And I think that that kind of empirical report is the evidence you need to question the ACE approach, because there's a danger. We want to address trauma, we want to support people to succeed in achieving fulfilling lives, but they need to be able to define what those lives are. That's what the Glasgow Effect report tells us. And it also tells us that when you don't enable people to take control of their lives locally, that you end up with 30% more likely to die from the big three, cancer, stroke and heart disease, that you have increased illnesses of despair and suicide, and we see that in the stats in Scotland at the moment, with increases since 2007 and during austerity. You see over a 6-decade period, over 300,000 lives were shortened in Glasgow and other working class areas of Scotland compared to people from similar backgrounds in Manchester and Liverpool. And I think you have to hold to account the parties that were in power. I mean, Labour and Tory parties were in power at Westminster. Labour had a stranglehold over most councils in Scotland, and they were to be the party of the working class. But they made some shocking decisions concerning the movement of people and the rehousing of people in communities and the disempowerment of communities. And it's very clear in Leslie Riddick's book, where she discusses, she compares the health outcomes for people where there was a community housing association that took control of its tenement block, compared to an area where the tenement blocks were knocked down and the people were disempowered in Glasgow. And she shows you very clearly how the Glasgow effect, the disempowerment, led to different kinds of health outcomes. So, having looked at that in a slightly depressing way, what are the alternatives? So, myself and Christina Mallory-Quarrell discuss empathetic approaches. So there's different kinds of empathy. There's affective empathy, where a person feels that what another person is going through, and they mirror and they say, oh, yeah, I've gone through that too. I think you have to be careful with that, because as we said earlier, you can never assume another person's interpretation of the same event is the same, that their feelings going through that event are the same as yours. So the alternative to that is cognitive empathy, where you take perspectives, where you try and see it from the other people's point of view. And I think that is very important for professionals who are trying to support children and families to find the solutions to their life issues. We know that empathetic people are more likely to help other people, even if it goes against their own interest. And empathy reduces bullying and racism, and enables intimacy in relationships. It makes people more likely to stand up against equality together, and ignites a willingness to work together across social groups. So whilst we are talking about how ACE's impact on working class children disproportionately, it's also very important to remember that all sorts of children have adverse childhood experiences, and that we have to support middle class children as well who lose their parents or have experienced abuse. That abuse isn't only a working class thing. And I think that this, wherever there is power, and adult power misused, there can be abuse of children, and that's in any family. So I think we have to be very careful about the way the ACEs discourse and some of the discourses around the closing the attainment gap kind of focus us in a negative way about working class families. And I think we have also written on the People Republics of Scotia blog that we have to call out the politics of Westminster. The politics of Westminster is not empathetic. Similarly, the politics of Trump is not empathetic. And I think that we've seen with the changes in the welfare approach to disabled people, the welfare approach to families with more than 2 children, that Theresa May and Ruth Davidson's approach to politics lacks empathy. So this raises the question for us: how do we support empathy? Sean Ginwright earlier was saying it can be developed through music. Pat Dolan has done quite a big research project on this, and he is connecting empathy with sport, academic achievement, altruism such as volunteering, involvement in music, involvement in creative arts, involvement in hobbies. So he's saying that empathy can be learned by children through these different routes. And he uses it with Mark Brennan in 2016. He wrote on a youth civic engagement model, and he saw a connection between social support that is reciprocal, resilience that is protective, so people have built their own resilience, and self-efficacy. So that's, he calls it mastery, belonging, independence, generosity. So what do we know? We know that if you shift power from adults to young people, if they start to use that power and they develop their independence, they then are more likely to develop empathy and develop a generous approach to their other community members. And similarly, they are more likely to develop resilience through having different experiences in the different areas of their life, including academic, sport, music, creative arts, etc. So this is a very good example of what we've been arguing throughout, or what I've been arguing throughout this talk, that if we take a children's rights approach rather than an ACE resilience approach, then we're more likely to support the resilience of young people. How ironic is that? Yeah. Pat Dolan says that the factors that influence empathy are social responsibility, so he draws from Flanagan, who talk about the need for us to have regard for the welfare of other people. He connects that with notions of civic engagement, which he draws from Metzger and Smetana, to argue that we move to a pro-social society where we're active in our communities when we connect empathy and social responsibility. So he defines empathy as the ability to understand, the cognitive empathy of others, the ability to share affective emotions, and the ability to share the feelings of others. So he combines the two different approaches that myself and Christina discussed. He combines them, says you don't have to choose between the two. Both are useful in different ways. Pat argues that when we move to a position where children and families are involved in empathetic action, it opens up new relationships. It creates reciprocity of support and better networks in our communities, and I think this is where we get to the point of informal support and minimal intervention. So if the solution isn't always the professional intervening, if when professionals overly intervene, or if we use ACE checklists, the likelihood is we decrease self-esteem. When we enable people to develop empathetic action, to take action and solve the solutions in their own lives, it increases self-esteem and also the esteem they get from other people. And Pat draws from Honneth and notions of social justice to argue that why this is important is that it changes the focus from focusing on one's own difficulties to one's own abilities. So that's like Sean Ginwright earlier, and my own writing on disability studies. If we think of social justice, Pat uses Honeth's social justice view. Pat Dolan uses the view that social justice is a recognition of the person's right to be treated with positive regard and affectionate care, and the right to have the person's attributes or strengths as defined by community of interests. Later on, I'll show how children and young people define social justice in a few slides' time. But if we think about that in Scotland, since 2005, we've had the GIRFEC model, getting it right for every child, and it's sought to shift the power relations in children's services. Although we should say that practices vary within and across local authorities, but there are some examples of very good practice where we use joint planning between different services and a single assessment model, usually with a key worker who carries the ball between meetings, to ensure that plans that we develop with children and parents actually come to fruition. And you could also look at the work of Stradlin and McNeil, who've done a number of projects in the Highlands around the Getting It Right for Every Child approach. And they also write about the joint assessment model that the My World Triangle that we have utilised within the single assessment approach. So rather than having lots of different professionals assess the need and maybe argue over the need, we now have a process where there should be one single professional who's doing the assessment, but it involves information from other professionals. But the centre of that is that you first ask the child what their needs are. So if we quickly just talk about the My World Triangle, there's three sides to the triangle: how I grow and develop, what I need from people who look after me, my wider world. So if we look at how I grow and develop, a professional will ask questions about being healthy, learning to be responsible, learning and achieving, becoming independent, looking after myself, being able to communicate, enjoying family and friends, confidence in who I am. So you can ask questions of the young people. You can see there the resilience kind of is quite individualistic, that side of the triangle, but it is useful if a person says, look, I'm irresponsible because I have dyslexia and the teacher just doesn't get it and she's always shouting at me, then it's not an individualized approach. It sees the relationship, and equally if it's I'm getting into trouble with a certain group of friends, it sees irresponsibility as not something that is evil or ununderstandable. It sees it as something that is connected to relationships. And I should add that in the Blairite era, people used to connect responsibility and rights. Actually, you have rights. Rights are indelible. You don't have to. A child does not have to be responsible to access their right to education. An adult like myself, if I decide to go out and get drunk tonight and the police beat me up, throwing me in the back of the meat wagon because I've been stupid, I still have my rights. I have my rights not to be assaulted, my right not to my life to be endangered. And so that is where rights trump responsibility. Actually, when you're being irresponsible, you need your rights the most. Similarly, on the other side of the triangle, what I need from people who look after me, so they will ask the child whether they have guidance or support to make good choices, the right choices, everyday care and help. Are people keeping me safe? Knowing what is going to happen and when, being there for me, understanding my family history, background and beliefs, playing, encouragement and fun. So just taking the knowing what is happening to me. So I would give you an example from working with a young person with mental health issues. She argued that her mental health issues were exacerbated because professionals, when she had an acute episode, would take the power away from her. So they would move her to a residential setting. She lived in the north of England, and they would move to a town about 30 miles, 40 miles away, and and she didn't know if they'd told her friends or family where she was. When she arrived there was no information on what the rules of this institution were, whether you could go out your room, what you were going to do. So it exacerbated her anxiety. So knowing what is going to happen and when is a really important thing to think about. And also children and parents tell us that trust is built when professionals are really clear about the processes, where they don't make promises they can't keep, where they don't make plans and then don't follow them up. So actually having services deliver at the points and times you want is really good. And similarly, we can see on this side play, encouragement and fun. The solution, if you use an ACE discourse, the solution might be loads of counselling. So you concentrate and reify and double up on the negativity. The solution may not be anything to do with the ACE. The solution actually, in that sense of creativity, empathy and the connections, play, encouragement, enjoyment and fun. Moving resources to the point where you actually enable the children to overcome some of the things that's happened to them because they're now living a fulfilling life and they've put that other stuff into context. It's a real danger that the ACE discourses redirects resources in a way that children and parents don't want. Just to finish off now, I'm going to talk about children's own things that they want to change in their life. So the Children's Commissioner did some research, and they have a number of bullet points from the findings of the summary of the research for what children and young people identify the key things in their life. So they want an enriched quality of life. You can see that's a direct response to austerity. So not having resources for creativity, play, fun, building relationships. They want the same chances no matter how much money their families have. Do you see the sense of fairness coming out here and the things that they want resolved? Do you notice that? That's not on the ACE list. Yeah, they want to be included no matter how different they are. Now the problem with the ACE discourse is it excludes. Yeah, it kind of concentrates on your worst bits. To be included, we need to support a person's best side, to support a person's capabilities, and see them as having abilities to be included. And that particularly goes with disabled children, who often aren't creatively included in mainstream schooling. And maybe they're included in a classroom, but not in all social aspects of the setting. Professionals need to question adult-child power relations, and they need to enable social, cultural, and spiritual transformation. I showed this slide to a teacher when she said, "I don't like the word transformation," and I found that problematic. It's like, so we're going to define them by their lists of ACEs, and we're going to have list checklists, but we can't get to a point where that doesn't matter anymore. That's what transformation is. Transformation is an important thing for children in their lives, but transformation also, if we think of a chrysalis, or we think of nature, how things evolve through the seasons, transformation is around us all the time, and children have a really close connection with nature, so they understand that transformation is definitely possible, and also as an aspiration. They want greater involvement in decision making, for scientists to recognise them as an untapped resource who have much to offer Scotland, and their top 4 issues are being safe and secure, treated fairly, respected and being included. So we can see how they're getting it right for every child. The My World Triangle, concentrating on issues of well-being, also kind of celebrates these things that children themselves have identified as important, children and young people. And we know also that this isn't just Scottish children, because there's studies in England, and I was involved in a study in Scotland with back at Milburn in 2000. There was also Morrow 2000 and Ridge 2002 in England, that children build their view of inclusion is that it's built through relationships. So they want to have a home that's suitable for a friend to visit. They want to be able to access transport links in their social networks so that they can actually get those relationships going. You can't go to a creative club if you can't afford the bus trip. Yeah, if you can't afford the specific clothing for a sports activity or a school trip, you don't get into that more creative social space. And young people in the earlier 2000 research, showed that they wanted respect and fair relationships in schools. We see this is constantly coming out in both the Scottish research and the English research. They had a fear of vandalism, racism, the police, so the people who are supposed to be sorting them, they're scared of, and of sexual attack. So it's not to say that that these issues that are in the ACE checklist aren't things that young people experience and don't want to experience. Sometimes it's more the fear than the reality, and we also know that the vast majority of families are very caring places. So we always have to balance fear, reality, and abuse, so that we're not chasing and spending resources investigating things that aren't actually happening. And Andy Bilson's research shows that many more cases are reported than actually warrant investigation. So we have to be very careful that the ACE discourse doesn't become a witch hunt. And that's not to downplay young people's fears, because we know young people do experience abuse, but it's to say we have to put it into context. And the Ridge research and the Morrow research showed there was a lack of play facilities and aesthetic areas, and a lack of inclusion in decision-making processes at home and school. And we know that still happens. There was a Jane Brown, Edinburgh University research showing that school councils don't really work. They work more in rural areas and smaller schools, but in the larger schools they don't really work. Similarly, I wrote an article with Louise Hill, Kay Tisdall, Liam Cairns and Selwyn McCausland for the 2014 referendum for the Reid Foundation, called Social Justice, the Commonweal and Children and Young People, and we found very similar things. But our one also identified that in terms of social justice, bullying by adults is something that children bring up a lot, and they also care about their parental income. It's interesting about that they don't necessarily want so much money themselves, but they want their parents to be able to have money so they don't have to work two jobs. So they see it in a very relational way. And in that paper, we see that social justice could be a change in resources, so access to legal aid. A lot of children can't access legal aid and push forward their rights. It could be access to recognition, as was the case in the Pat and Sean Ginwright writing. It could be access to restorative ways of thinking. So it could be that children and parents want recognition of the history of an issue. So if we think about that in Canada or with Indigenous people, there's a history of discrimination, or in America, Black rights movement, a history of discrimination, and you have to recognize that history in order to be able to work with those young people. The ACE discourse just doesn't do that. It doesn't look at the context of racism. So this is telling us that social justice isn't just one thing. It's both the way we think about other human beings, our concepts, where they see their abilities, but it's also whether they have access to powerful ways of being powerful in community, they have access to resources, and they have access to respect and fairness. In terms of the getting it right for every child, we would argue that because we know these are the things that children want to change in their lives, we know that adults also want to change things in their lives, that when we're doing an assessment from a professional perspective, if we're trying to look at the alternatives to the ACE discourse, if we're trying to look at the alternatives that actually shift power into the hands of parents and children, that we have to do a GIRFEC or My World Triangle, not just for the child, but for the parent and for community members and for professionals. A holistic approach requires us to question the pressures that the professionals under. Can they get to work in the morning without completely being harassed by the transport system? Do they have relationships of support? Do they need debriefing after certain cases? Do they need peer support because some of the things that they're working with have an emotional effect on them? So we need empathetic approaches for the professional as much as for the parents and children. We also know that there's a perverse incentive in children's services when performance indicators put top-down pressure on professionals. So what we have now is we have things like PEF, which is the Pupil Equity Fund, which is seeking to resolve the attainment gap in Scottish schools. But that's creating a pressure because you have to evaluate the money that you get and you have to show it's made an impact. Yeah, and that kind of pressure means that we aren't approaching the solutions from the children's perspective, and from a children's rights perspective, from a learning perspective, we're approaching learning from an attainment perspective that we can prove has changed. So we're not necessarily approaching these issues from a way that enshrines children's rights and children's perspectives of social justice. And I would say the ACE discourses are dangerous, as is the PERF approach, if it denies children's own views of what the outcomes should be, and denies parents' views and denies professional and community members' local knowledge of what works. We need to balance local knowledge with empirical knowledge. It's not an either or. We have to understand that adults have their own reasons for not being able to listen to children, not being able to deliver on joint assessments. That the pressures they're under break down the relationships within their professional groupings and their ability to deliver services. And therefore, we need to be honest about the limitations and the capacities of the professionals. And that will break down the trust boundary between adults, community members, families, and professionals. So if we can build trust and be honest and open about our own pressures and demystify the process in a holistic way, we'll be able to see how children's services, health services, welfare services, education services can all be connected to support children and parents and community members to achieve the outcomes that they want. And in the end, in my book, 2011 book, and my book with Mary Smith in 2012, we argue that we need a politically nuanced, holistic, anti-discriminatory, inclusive, participatory and socially just approach. That is the alternative to ACE. And we need to balance the redistribution of resources, universal approaches, compensatory approaches where universal approach is like universal childcare or universal education. Compensatory is where we see that a wrong has been done and we try and support people, like welfare and benefits might compensate for losing your job. And targeted approaches, which actually specifically aim to support a specific child or a specific group of children. We need to balance those and have flexible solutions. And in my book with Mary Smith, and in my 2011 book on integrated children's services, I talk about the different ways we need to cooperate and coordinate and share resources in local authorities to enable those flexible solutions to come about. And in the end, so to conclude, to answer the questions I said at the start, why are we using the term ACE instead of abuse? I think because some people are making profit out of childhood misery. There's a real danger that it gives a smaller group of professionals, instead of a multi-professional approach, gives a smaller group of professionals the power. So I think it's about power, and we have to be really careful. Some people are getting sucked into that debate from the best of traditions, and I would say people like John Carnacan, who did incredible work in Glasgow on knife crime. They are in that debate because they want to help children. Other people are in that debate for less philanthropic reasons. So the second question, why are we asking folk to self-label as ACE? Because if you make a person focus on their weakness, you can then control them. So I really have suspicions that certain discourses are there in order to support professional power. So we really have to question those. And also it means that politicians don't have to take responsibility for really poor policy making that is unfair and creates inequality. In answer to the question, who does such a way of speaking make powerless and powerful? You going to shift the power to the person who wants to fix the individual, instead of making powerful the person who's experienced the adverse childhood experience themselves. So we have to be really careful of that. What are the problems with checklists? A checklist labels what we cannot do and defines us by our worst experiences rather than adopting social justice strengths-based and affirmative model perspectives. So I've given you the solution in the second half of the talk. The solution is a complex approach which shifts power to children and young people. And the final question, what does a considered multidisciplinary and well-researched approach to childhood say is the solution? We should address, and my answer is we should address, in final conclusion, we should address the root causes on childhood inequality and injustice, including poverty, poor housing, lack of access to the law, education, clubs,